Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this important webinar, The Social Ecology of Resilience, the many ways families and communities nurture a child's well-being. I cannot think of a more timely topic during these times. I am Sarah Dinklage, the Executive Director of Rhode Island Student Assistance Services, and we are proud to bring you this series of webinars focusing on youth mental health and trauma and the unique role that parents and educators play in fostering resilience and mental health in children. This series is brought to you by the Rhode Island Department of Health and Rhode Island Student Assistance. Located below this video, you will see a description box with links to our website and Facebook page, where we will let you know when more content like this will be released. In addition to these items, we have created a post survey to get your input on the content being provided. After completing the survey, you also have the ability to receive contact hours for your time spent watching this presentation. There will be a reminder towards the end of our video to take the survey for a chance to win a $100 gift card. We are extremely honored and fortunate to be able to bring Dr. Michael Ungar to a Rhode Island audience. Dr. Ungar is the founder and director of the Resilience Research Center at Dalhousie University in Halifax. His groundbreaking work as a family therapist and resilience researcher is recognized around the world, with much of that work focused on the resilience of marginalized children and families experiencing mental health challenges at home and in the workplace. Dr. Ungar has provided consultation and training to Fortune 500 and educational institutions and government agencies on 5 continents. During his presentation, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will get to as many as possible at the end. Thank you again for your interest in this very important and timely topic, and I am now pleased to turn it over to Dr. Ungar.
Sarah, thank you very much for this invitation. First of all, what an absolute pleasure to be able to support the Rhode Island Student Assistance Services. The work that you do, I mean, from what I've seen on the website and just the people I've met so far in prepping for this, it's really interesting to see all these different organizations across Canada, the United States, into Europe, et cetera, all doing quite amazing work and supporting kids, especially during this incredibly difficult time. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic as sort of a backdrop to this, but I'm going to focus in on aspects of resilience that are not just pandemic related, because of course the vaccines are coming. I think we're going to see quite a significant change in children's lives and hopefully a return to normal within the next short while. So more generally, I'm actually more concerned that when the pandemic is over, that we're actually able to return children back to somewhat normal lives. And what's it going to mean in terms of ensuring their resilience? And that is going to depend a lot on educators, on families and communities. Now, in terms of getting into my headspace around resilience, I know that a lot of people think of resilience as that individual capacity to overcome adversity. Sometimes people talk about it as bouncing back. But I'm hoping I can sort of, shake the snow cone a little bit here tonight and change that definition for you. Because when you say, the capacity to overcome adversity or bounce back, you're kind of implying that that's all on the shoulders of the individual child, which kind of means like, why do they need mental health therapists? Why do they need good educators? If it's all about them individually doing it, then why don't they just do it? Plus, there's the other problem was if they don't do it, then somehow it's their fault, that they're to blame. And that's made sometimes this word resilience get a little bit too focused on the individual rugged qualities and not enough also on the resources that are required to build us, to make us more resilient. So let me see if I can kind of explain this. So a while back, I was working with a girl who was referred to me I had a mental health practice in a clinic in the community, but she was referred by the education system to see me because she wasn't attending school, or that's at least what I've been told. She was about 14 years old. Now, what caught my attention about her, and the story I knew about her, was she was living in poverty. She had a lot of some challenges in her life, single mom, there was another younger sibling in the home, a little bit of chaos, public housing, lots of sort of challenges in this child's life, including some learning challenges as well. But what caught my attention is when she came to see me, she actually brought a printout from some sort of news feed or something that showed a picture of her and her friends sitting in front of a local 7-Eleven store with the banner across the top saying, "Gangs ruining neighborhood." Now, I guess for her, she kind of brought this in and she had printed it out, obviously, and she showed it to me. She says, "Look, that is me." And it was like she was fiercely proud. Like it was like a picture of her as the valedictorian of her graduating class or something. And yet she'd kind of missed that it was about her being part of a sort of a wannabe gang and terrorizing the community and everything. So I kind of get that there's something kind of unique about this kid. Anyways, I got talking to her. I say, you don't go to school. And she says, I go to school. She gets all indignant and angry with me for saying that. I said, well, actually, that's what the referral says. I open up my paper and I show her, and your teacher, your social worker, the police, everyone says you don't go to school. Anyway, she says, well, I go to school. So I throw the paper aside. I say, when do you go to school? She said, well, I go to school sometimes to help my grade 8 English teacher. Sorry, you go to school to help your teacher. Explain this to me. And she says, yeah, well, I don't go all the time, but when I do go, I go to help her. How do you help your teacher? She says, well, she's a newbie teacher. Like she's really young and she doesn't know how to get the class to be all quiet. And so what I did, like the other day, she couldn't get the class to be quiet. So what I did was, and she does this in my office, she climbs up on her chair, stands up on the chair in my office, and says, and then she puts her fingers in her mouth like this, and she does one of those really, really loud whistles, which I can't do, but you can imagine what it sounded like. And then she says, so standing like that, she whistles like that, and then she shouts at the top of her lungs, "Shut up!" Except she didn't miss the missing word that I just missed in the middle. Now you can imagine in a grade 8 public school, if your kid does that everyone shuts up. They literally go, "Oh my gosh, unbelievable." Well, supposedly I was kind of enthralled as well. And then she said, so I asked her, well, what happened next? And she said, well, then her teacher came over, looks up at her while she's standing on the desk and says, "Thank you." Now, somewhere there's like a special heaven for teachers, I think, or something. And that's an amazing path there, right? Like that's an amazing intervention for this kid. So basically this girl sits back down, carries on the class. And at the end of the class, she said the teacher pulled her over again and said, "Thank you for doing that. But next time you want to help, please don't stand on the furniture and don't use the F word." Now, look, it's kind of, you might think, okay, you said this kid's resilient. This kid is resilient. You see, she's growing up in a really tough space without a lot of resources. And she's coping as best she possibly can. So my job and the school's job became an opportunity. How could we create opportunities for her to get that same sense of leadership, that same sense of power, that same identity, that same sense of belonging, that same sense of connection to an adult, but in a more socially desirable way? And that's what we did. We got her involved in peer mentoring in the school. And while she was in the school, we got her a tutor and we got her some support so she wouldn't feel so stupid when she was in the school. In other words, we created a rich environment of social experiences, of connections and attachments, of opportunities to use her rather dramatic personality that didn't involve becoming a gang member on the streets, using drugs, becoming sexually active, et cetera, et cetera. So when I'm beginning to think about resilience then, I guess what I'm really talking about here then is this need to find the resources for success. And that ability to find what we need for success depends on the quality of our social built and indeed our natural environment. And you can imagine during this pandemic, it's been a tough year for kids. A lot of those resources just haven't been available to them. To be fair, I just want to sort of situate this a little bit for you. There's if you're going to talk about resilience, you first have to acknowledge stress. If a kid just comes out of a very stable, happy-go-lucky, well-supported household, good, well-resourced school, and they just have a little bit of stress transitioning from grade 6 into a new school in grade 7 or something like that. That's not resilience. That's just normative life crises. Resilience refers to more, well, an atypical or unanticipated stress, like a pandemic, for instance, or adverse childhood experiences. You may have seen this list or heard that there was a study that happened several decades ago by Robert Anda and others that sort of said that, if you have any of these 10 really nasty things, like the sixth one there is witnessing intimate partner violence, so your parents are abusive towards each other, or etc. Those things happen before your 18th birthday. You're much more likely to have problems later in life as an adult. And we also know from some recent work done out of Philadelphia that you have to begin to add some of the social justice conversation. So it's not just those things inside your family, it's also what happens to you in your community, like the violence you might witness or the quality of your neighborhood, or if you've ever been discriminated against because of racism, etc. Those things also put us in peril as we age. Now, a lot of people, they look at the bottom of the bar graph. They want to know that if you have 4 or more of those nasty things happening to you, then you're more likely to have depression as an adult. But I don't study that. I try and figure out, why is it that if you have 4 or more of these bad things happen to you, 51% of us still do not develop depression during our adult years? So what explains that? And that becomes the subject of kind of like resilience. There's a group of researchers out of the US and elsewhere, in this case led by Angela Naran, who's doing stuff on benevolent childhood experiences. And guess what? She's finding that, if you felt safe with your caregiver, or you had a good friend, or indeed if you like school or a teacher who cared about you, these things, these environments counteract against even the nastiest of bad things that can happen to kids, which kind of gives us some hope here. Even as the pandemic unfolds, even as we know there will be lingering consequences. A lot of children have lost 6 months to a year of their education. They have not made the right gains. Families that were more disadvantaged because and I'm sure you know this, and obviously you're thinking about how you support families and kids, et cetera, and obviously those without good internet access or where there's other troubles inside the home are going to have been affected most. So we're going to have to create environments that are rich in opportunities for these kids to basically, bounce back, if you will. But that's going to happen because we intervene and help them. What then is resilience if it's not just our individual capacity to bounce back, to think positive thoughts, to cope as best we can? Well, what if we sort of talked about it first, where, if I've convinced you here a little bit that where there's exposure to something that's significant, some adversity that's significant, then maybe our resilience is our ability to navigate, to make our way towards the resources that we need to support us, whether they're psychological, social, cultural, physical, a teacher who cares about you, a family that's more significant, even a social worker can be helpful, a tutor, a coach, someone who sees the potential in you will actually sort of awaken these kinds of things. So what we're talking about is this ability to navigate. But if you think about it, you can't just navigate without a destination, right? I mean, imagine I send you off into the ocean without a compass and say, go navigate. But there's no island to land on, no food sources to gather. You just navigate. You don't go anywhere, which implies that as much as we want kids to feel motivated to change and to get better, et cetera, they have to have places to land. They need the resources to give into them so that they can actually thrive. And that could be, say, for instance, I'm always disappointed when I see schools cutting arts programs and band practices, or when their sports teams are so competitive and restrictive that kids who just want to play more recreationally can't play. Because in each of those decision points, we literally cut off children from the resources they need, the things that might spark them, that might make, frankly, schooling just a little bit more enjoyable. And I was actually just talking to a bunch of educators a few days ago, and they were saying that's what they most lamented, was that the fact that some of the kids that were most at risk, the ones who only came to school to go to art class or play a musical instrument or hang out with their friends at lunch hour or be on a team, that those kids had completely lost their motivation to study when they were being forced to homeschool during the pandemic. So we begin to think about, okay, you have to be able to navigate to find what you need, but you also need to be able to negotiate or ask for what you need to provide it to you in culturally meaningful ways. Ways that you value, ways that you think is important. So if you're a socially anxious child, and and your teachers and your teaching staff, saying, okay, we got to integrate you back into the school, and we're gonna, I don't know, get you into doing, your assignment is public speaking or something crazy like that, and you just go off you're off the Richter scale in terms of tremors and stuff because I'm never going to be able to do this, right? But I've seen creative solutions to that. So I remember when my son he's now in his mid-20s, but when he was in high school, I remember he used to DJ at the school. But what was really clever was the school had set him up so that he would invite the kids who were more socially anxious, those who had trouble engaging at school. Those would be the kids that he would ask to help him set up the equipment. Now, if you think about it, if you're, to be a DJ, my son is very extroverted, so he's going to be at the front of the room. But what was really cool was engaging kids who are much more socially anxious and being in the wings, in the dark parts of the room when you're having an assembly. And they would be the ones, plugging in those amps, making that big sound, being the ones to, help set things up. They had a role in the school that was behind the scenes. It was a good negotiation with them to say, we want you to come to school. We want to find a place for you beyond the academics. We want to make this place feel like you're making a contribution. We want to give you a powerful identity. And all those things were successful by engaging them in an activity where they felt safe. So it's helping them navigate, but negotiating with them so that they can actually have an experience that is matched to their needs specifically. Now, if I could just kind of bringing this along, these concepts of navigation and indeed negotiation. Okay, so those are your two basic sort of foundation stones for resilience. Kids who can navigate and negotiate better, they tend to be able to find what they need to survive a bad situation. But there are patterns to this. And I just want to go through these. What we're actually seeing, so I do research, as Sarah sort of summarized, do research all over the world. We have literally millions of dollars in funded studies going on. And in addition to the clinical work I do as well, there's patterns that keep emerging in what makes a successful child. I just want to go through this. The first one, interestingly, is actually structure, which is really great news because everyone thinks, hey, that's great, Children do much better. When I go to, Cambodia, Southern Florida, Ireland, where I am in a rural indigenous community somewhere in Northern Canada, the kids who tend to get through better are those that have that structure to their lives. And you can think about during this pandemic, of course, you're thinking about kids who have that structure as well. The bedtimes, the meal times, the expectations on them that they'll study, that there's some routines in their life, that there's chores still, dogs have to be walked, et cetera, et cetera. All of those activities are known to make kids more impervious to the threats of depression and anxiety. If you think about it, what does the Red Cross do? What is their first line of a mental health intervention after a major wildfire or flood or whatever? You don't send in psychologists. What you send in, or what you do, is you get kids to go back to school. That is the mental health intervention. In the routines, if you want to create optimism, you don't tell a child to go stand in front of a mirror and think positive thoughts. You do that after you get them back into a classroom where their life again feels normal. That expectation of normalcy, that sense that if I got through today and it happened in a way I expected, and that routine or that structure that will happen tomorrow cues me that gosh darn, it's going to happen again tomorrow. It's like us adults. We go to the same coffee shop on the way to work. We order the same drink at Starbucks or wherever, and I get known to the barista as, oh, you're the extra foam, extra hot double cappuccino or whatever, It's that systematic routine that gets us through a crisis. And by the way, for kids, they also need consequences, not punishment. They need that sense that they can fix their own mistakes. Two kids squabbling constantly over fighting in front of some gaming system, whatever, they separate. The task is not to punish them. The task is to say, fine. One of you uses it at a time, and the only way you guys are ever going to play together on that system again is when you guys come up with a solution. What is your solution? And convince me as the parent that it's actually going to work. I'm not going to come up with a solution. It's too complicated. I'm not going to have some timer on this. It's too complicated. I'm going to let the kids kind of actually take some responsibility for finding their own consequence. There's also the need, I'd say, for that strong connection between a parent and child, or a caregiver, or whoever that person is in that child's life. But I just wanted to sort of caution, you might notice there's actually 9 things here. And the theory on resilience, what we actually understand about resilience is they're all 9 of these are important, and you can start with any of the 9. I know some of my colleagues will sometimes argue, if you just are loved by one person, that everything else happens. And that's actually not true, because there's lots of other ways to start. If you think about this as 9 dominoes in a circle, it kind of doesn't matter which one you knock over to start the cycle. So I can just provide a child with structure and reasonable consequences, even if they don't have a consistent parent who's meeting their needs, or maybe a parent who's badly traumatized by everything, whose job has disappeared because of the pandemic, who's super stressed by money and everything else, who's just not responsive to that child, then fine. Let's at least get some structure in that child's life. Because there's also the possibility of that child encountering lots and lots of other strong relationships as well, from teachers, for instance. Even, by the way, let's be honest about this, online communities. There's actually some great research emerging finally that says, look, obviously if a child's on, in the internet for 8 hours a day, that ain't good. But then again, eating broccoli 6 times a day isn't good for you either, sort of thing, right? So the point is, too much of anything is bad. But if a child, the research seems to be saying, if a child over the age of 5 has a reasonable access to the internet and is actively, not passively, but actively engaged with the content. In other words, not just watching TikTok videos, but posting some sort of Instagram or TikTok, doing something actively, playing games online that are actually interactive with other people. Even that seems to be rather benign to children. Again, as long as it's not, 15 hours a day sort of thing, of course. But in a balanced sort of portfolio of life, a child engaged online, as long as it's not toxic social media, but in that engagement is actually not necessarily bad. And during this pandemic, I think we've learned that for some children, those kinds of other strong relationships, if they're not in person, then they're possibly online. And that those can actually carry a child through, because one of the biggest threats to our kids right now is loneliness. In fact, I know this is going to sound kind of crazy, but actually there's some sort of developmental psychologists and others in the field who are actually worried about the levels of loneliness amongst our children in the next generation. And they're actually, I know that we tend to think about our children being incredibly rampant sexuality and sexually active and all this kind of stuff, but the statistics actually are showing a downward trend in terms of our children's sexual activity. I'm talking, of course, teenagers now. And that has never gone in that direction ever, really. It's mostly been flat for the last 50 to 60 years in terms of sexual activity amongst kids. It's actually going down right now. And the worry is that our kids are actually not, tongue in cheek here a little bit, but sexually active enough, or not at least being intimate with each other, not reaching out, not having those relationships. So lots and lots of strong relationships need to be encouraged. Obviously, a child needs a powerful identity. They need to be able to say something. I like to think of this as the John Travolta walk. Okay, I know I'm dating myself here, but that Saturday Night Fever, that Travolta-like image of him walking down the street with the music blaring behind him, and he's in his white suit, he's going to go dance, and he's just strutting. He carries himself as if he's the center of the universe. And there's a huge amount of evidence that our identities, if you look at, our co-constructions, meaning that we rely on others to sort of be mirrors back to us to tell us who we are, just like Travolta in that movie. And how do we give that to a child so that they know that, is it that they put up something on the web? The one I always love is, look, if you have a kid at home, I always say to parents, let them do something of higher status. Don't tell them to clean their room. Tell them to bake the cake for grandpa's birthday party. And yes, it's going to look like a Pinterest fail, but I can guarantee you grandpa's going to like that cake a lot better than the perfect one that you cook yourself, right? So there's a sense here of giving kids opportunities to feel powerful, to show their stuff, as well as, of course, a sense of control, the sense that they have an opportunity to make decisions that actually affect their lives in age-appropriate ways. Barbara Coloroso used to do a lot of parenting work and stuff, and she used to say, a 3-year-old can't decide when to go to bed, but a 3-year-old can decide if he wears the blue pajamas or the green pajamas. And teens can let's face it, I don't think teens should be making decisions around whether or not the cell phone is on or in their room. I think cell phones outside the room for teenagers is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, especially if they're not performing well and they're having troubles in school and everything else. In other words, we can set some boundaries and encourage our children to actually have those. And I think schools are really good about giving children decision-making power. How do you want to study? What modality do you want to use? Those kinds of things. Of course, a sense of belonging. Children need that sense that they're connected, if it's through their spirituality. Anything that gives them a sense that their lives have a bigger purpose. Of course, you want their rights respected. You cannot really talk about resilience without also acknowledging social justice issues. We cannot think about somebody as, there's that movie, in The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, if you remember that from a few years ago. And he is an African-American male who's struggling to get onto Wall Street, and he ends up sleeping in the subway with his 5-year-old child in the toilets in the subway. And I mean, just a story of struggle and personal perseverance and everything else. Yes, of course, it's inspiring to see. But also, let's not forget that, first of all, he could solve a Rubik's Cube in like less than 3 minutes. So he's obviously has a certain propensity or intelligence, which is going to be a resource to him in life. But also, what always bothers me about watching that movie is I don't really give a care in the world about him being able to solve a Rubik's Cube in less than 3 minutes or 3 seconds or whatever it is in the movie that he can do it. If you rolled that movie back, or you tried to have that movie back in like 1955 or 1965 or maybe even 1975, those doorways to those jobs on Wall Street were closed to because of his race. Or we could argue about gender and the glass ceiling that many women experience. In other words, I think what we got to start thinking about is to just simply lamely say to someone, just believe in yourself and anything is possible, ignores the fact that, yes, it's a good attitude to start with, but the resilience, what the science on this really says is you also need an opportunity structure created by systemic changes and institutional changes and even governments that actually makes it possible for you to succeed and to have the life that you actually want. Safety, support is also part of resilience. You have to feel safe at night, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. How do I if I was to roll this all together for you a little bit, maybe I can, let me just help you a little bit here with this. So imagine, for instance, a little while ago, I worked with a young fellow, I think it was about grade 5, grade 6, awkward kid, bad teeth, no dental care, mom really traumatized by life, not doing too well. And this young fellow would go to school and he'd be bullied, just dressed in hand-me-down clothes. It just wasn't a good scene. Even though the school tried to create a safe environment, it wasn't working. And what this kid had figured out, though, which was kind of clever, I thought, was that he had figured out that rather than being jostled and bullied on the playground or recess or lunch hour, what he did was he would go and find the janitor, the custodian for the building at the school. And he would basically sidle up to him, just kind of position himself as close to him as he possibly could and follow him throughout the recess or the lunch hour. And the idea was that, of course, nobody would bother him that way. So this was brilliant. This guy has, he's no psychological training or anything. He's just a good salt of the earth. I know him, actually, a very good salt of the earth kind of guy. And he eventually turns to this kid and he says, well, damn it. If you're always going to be underfoot, pick up a mop and give me a hand. And the kid goes, okay. He's 10 years old, right? He picks up a mop and he starts mopping the floor with the janitor, right? This is wild. And now what happens when the kids come in from the recess or whatever, they don't jostle him in the hallway. He parts them like the Red Sea. I mean, when you see someone mopping the floor, you look down, you see the wet floor, you see someone mopping, most kids won't walk over it. They walk around him. And then they actually say, I'm sorry. They defer to him. This kid is like John Travolta walking around with his mop. He feels so powerful. Now let's go through the checklist here for a second. He has some structure to his day. He knows he's needed. He has a connection with another adult, a strong relationship. There's a powerful identity. He feels like he's making a genuine contribution. Now he feels like he belongs at a school he never felt like he belonged at. I know he doesn't do well at school. He has learning challenges, but none of that matters because suddenly he has found something that he's actually good at. Now, I know the occupational health and safety laws would say you can't have 10-year-olds mopping floors. That janitor probably broke about 14 different laws. The lawyers would have a field day, and I tell them to all go, never mind what they should be told. But the point is, that kid had found, in the absence of anyone else helping him, he'd found his solution. He had found these things. And this is the secret. If you want to actually intervene and help a kid, the more of these things your efforts tick. So if someone comes to me and says, I'm going to give this child a decision, that's great. If that decision involves increased structure in their lives and a strong and developing relationships, or a better sense of belonging, or helps them honor their rights, makes them feel safer. When you are actually going, if you're thinking about what will work and be successful, you want more and more of these boxes to be ticked. So, there's lots of ways of sort of talking about this. If you're more of a professional educator or a professional therapist, I know I was told that, obviously that would attract here for the Rhode Island Student Assistance Services. Of course, you have lots of folks who actually provide services, I imagine, on this event. And if that's the case, we do have a measure of resilience. This is all open source, free to download, to assess children's resilience. You can actually find this there on my website for the center that I lead. But I'm also sort of thinking, why don't I just walk you through some questions that we can just discuss in a more topical, more conversational way with kids? Because what I actually know is that the more the kids can fill in these blanks, which I'm going to go through in a second, the more likely they are to be able to withstand stress. In fact, we actually are beginning to understand that kids who before the pandemic had these blanks filled in were probably the ones who are going to weather the pandemic that much better. So thinking of a kid maybe that you have in your life and in the school that you work or whatever, I'm just curious, can they answer these questions? Could they say, there are people in my life who expect me to blank? And it's very clearly somebody. When I don't meet expectations, I know that blank will happen. I can reach out to my blank to get help when I need it. Is a child securely, do they really know who that is? How about, I feel respected for what's special about me when I'm with or at or doing? How about in my blank, I get to participate in making decisions that affect my blank, belonging or spirituality. At my blank, people miss me when I'm not there. And that you can imagine during the pandemic how that's been shortchanged in a lot of kids' lives. So it's exactly that. How about there are places such as blank where I can celebrate my culture and my beliefs. So there's that sense of actual place somewhere that I'm valued in a more historical way. And when I'm with others at my blank, I feel treated fairly. When I'm with blank, I am responsible for myself and others. This kind of sense of social justice built into this. So obviously, if you're celebrating your culture, the idea here is respectfully that others get to celebrate theirs as well, and that there's kind of multiple spaces in a community. I am well cared for by, and I feel safe when I'm with or at. The more of those blanks that a child can fill in, the better able they will be to be able to withstand stress in life, no matter how that stress manifests. I guess what I'm kind of getting at here, and this was something that was published in the Lancet Psychiatry recently, and myself and a colleague, Linda Theron, I guess what I'm getting at is we need to begin to think much more systemically. It's not nothing the way you structure your school playground, the equipment, whether or not there are elements to engage a child physically. The natural environment affects us, the built environment. When we built those brutalist architecture schools, those cement bunker-like schools of the 1970s, who in their right mind thought a child's brain would be stimulated in such an evil environment that looked like something out of a Star Wars movie rather than a place of learning? Our social environments matter, how we create environments that allow children to interact. The whole thing about the trying to get kids to eat healthier in schools is a systemic problem. Right? We know, for instance, that all those efforts to take French fries out of schools doesn't really change children's body mass indexes or to any appreciable amount, because what happens is the homes just simply compensate for the number of calories. What does seem to work, however, is when parents are engaged. In other words, you don't just think about trying to adapt a biological system or like what kids actually eat. You have to also change the social systems. You also have to get the parents on board. So you have to get them changing what's in the house for food, their eating habits. And when you actually work more holistically, when schools have reached out to parents and created a whole school approach of change, that's actually when they've seen bigger changes. Or when you actually change the environment of the cafeteria as well. School cafeterias look like something out of, I don't know, Orange is the New Black or something like that. I mean, they just look like prison venues, right? And I'm trying to sort of like say, but yet there's that Michael Smith and other chefs are sort of beginning to talk about changing the actual landscape of the cafeteria to make it smell better, make it look more like a Starbucks with lounging chairs and places. If you create environments where people slow down and eat and actually appreciate what they're eating, then maybe they'll eat a little bit healthier. This is where we're kind of getting, and by the way, we know that what we eat affects our microbiome, and that microbiome makes us more impervious to things like if our immune system is healthy, then we're probably more impervious not just to diseases, but also to psychological disorders like depression and anxiety. The whole thing is that these systems fit together, which, by the way, is no surprise that I was recently one of the scientific leads on something called the Cigna Resilience Index. That was just a large study in the US during the pandemic. And, we surveyed like 5,000 parents and 5,000 of their kids, and then young adults and workers and others. What was interesting was that, those questions I just asked you, about 45% of children between the ages of 5 and 10 mostly could answer those kinds of questions during the pandemic. They had sustained those things in their lives, which is pretty good. A lot of parents could too, partly you think about it, because they have meaning in their lives. They have things they have to take care of. They have their contribution. Their identities are secure. Who got really, really beat up by the pandemic has been young adults, in that, especially it goes down to about 16 as well. But that, those young adults, 18 to 23, I mean, other than people who've really gotten ill because of the pandemic, as a demographic, these kids have really had their lives changed dramatically. They can't just go meet each other. They can't go hook up. They can't. Proms are shortchanged. They're not going off to college the same way. I mean, there's just so much of their lives have been truncated and compromised. No wonder they're really struggling during this particular time. And, we can see it. I mean, if you think about it, this is something, if you want to read more, if you're more in this educational field, I do workshops on more, broader, the clinical interventions and that type of thing. But anyways, all this, I just want to give you a quick visual of, our kids are in weaves of like spider webs of associations and relationships with everything from their goldfish to their baseball teams to the treatment centers to their teachers, educators. We need to be thinking about all those different relationships and how we can actually support kids as best we possibly can, which I guess brings me to some real science. Okay, Cinderella. This story drives me a little bit nuts from a resilience point of view, because often it's told as Cinderella being this kind of resilient kid, right? Now, by the way, first of all, I apologize. This is the Disney version. It's the most common image of Cinderella. Extremely white, gender normative, incredible stereotypes here. But since this is the common image, I'm going to go with it here for a minute. The problem with the story is that it's always told from her point of view, this rugged bounce back. I mean, her mother dies, her father dies. She's raised by the evil stepmother. Poor stepmoms always get a bad rap. Then there's the evil stepsisters, whatever. And then along comes the fairy godmother, turns a pumpkin into a golden carriage, whisks her off to the ball. She meets the prince, has the right shoe size for the glass slipper, and everything kind of just goes hunky dory. One could have at least a little while ago said that's kind of Meghan Markle's story. Maybe it still will be. She got her prince, even if the story didn't quite turn out the way it was supposed to. Anyways, but back to Cinderella, if I might. What's interesting is the story's not really about Cinderella. It's about fairy godmothers. I'll prove it. You take out the fairy godmother, and all you got is an abused kid whose mother dies, father dies. She's living with an evil stepmother in an awful kingdom. This kingdom doesn't have schools, doesn't have social workers, has no truancy officers. The stupid prince, all he does is spend money on gala balls for the rich and famous. He does no social programs. What kind of evil, awful place is this, right? And of course, this kid would probably get to be, 14, 15, if she's like the kids that I've worked with a lot in my career. She's being abused. She's a working child. She's being exploited. She says to her stepmother, I'm out of here. Enough of this foolishness. She runs away, but she doesn't have the fairy godmother to take her into the prince's castle. So she ends up behind the castle, cold, hungry, swapping sex for a place to sleep at night, at high risk of being trafficked. So this story is really the difference between, Cinderella, the princess, and Cinderella, the trafficked kid who ends up in prostitution, whatever. Think about it. It's really that hinges on the fairy godmother. A while back, I was headed to, I was doing a talk in England for a large event, and one of the benefactors of that particular organization is Kate Middleton, one of, of course, the princess of the royal family. And I didn't know that, I didn't find out, but 2 days before I was about to fly over and do the talk on a similar theme, I'd been notified that Kate Middleton would be in the audience. And I remember as I was about to leave my house, my partner, she turns to me and says, Mike, Are you going to tell the story of the princess or the prostitute while Kate Middleton, a real princess, is actually in the room? And I thought to myself, that's a very good point. I mean, how often are you presenting and there's a real princess in the room, right? So I chickened out. I didn't tell the story. I used the different story that time, but I thought it might be a bit insulting. Anyways, but my point is that the story hinges on fairy godmothers, and you as educators or an organization, right, like Rises, is obviously a fairy godmother or fairy godfather, if you prefer, creating opportunities, creating the structures, giving the resources for kids to do well. Let me just show you one other potential explanation for this. Schools and environments can be adapted to give kids what they need in ways that make sense to them. So Goulval School, Southern England. This manual, by the way, is a free download if you're looking for it online off my websites. And I met this wonderful principal, and I've been trying to collect stories of what is a successful program, especially for educators. Met this guy, and he's been turning this school that was about to die because kids just weren't attending it. The parents weren't sending the kids there to this elementary school in Southern England. And what he did was, it was in a rural area, farmers. So he tried to make the school much more relevant to those families. In other words, he was trying to make it so the kids would navigate and he would negotiate with the families so that school became relevant for agribusiness and agricultural people. He tried to turn a school that was kind of losing its meaning for students into something much more meaningful. What parents were doing was sending their kids 20 miles down the road to a different kind of school that seemed to have more technologies and stuff. And as a consequence, they were going to lose the school in their own community, which is a real tragedy for small communities. So this is how this principal, Paul Baker, revitalized the school.
In terms of the population, the school, Goulval School, sits in a deprived, quite a deprived area. Nationally as well as within Europe.
We've been playing with this. There's a new program that my group, we've been asked for years to develop curriculum to actually be able to teach these ideas, and we're beginning to roll that out now to schools under the guise of this program we call it R2 Resilience. And what I really wanted to do was, I wanted to take all this knowledge that we have about mindfulness-based training, self-regulation, social and emotional learning that's focused on the individual child's development, and combine it with understanding also that we need to also build resources, whether that's good transportation systems or good natural environments, creating curriculum that allows kids to, think of things that are culturally relevant to them, any which way, forming relationships, creating the structures in their lives or whatever. When you get the rugged qualities and you get kids well-resourced, you are actually going to create the opportunities for resilience in their lives. So on that note, I am going to pass it back. I know we have some possibilities, some questions and stuff, and I'm going to pass it back to Sarah and the team. And I'm going to come out of this, and hopefully we can just have a few questions, a little chat here to round this out. And huge thank you again to Rises for the invitation with the, just great to see student assistance services sort of coming together and really reaching out to the community, especially during this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ungar. Let me just pull up the chat. I have received a few private messages as well. Yes, people can unmute and ask questions or type in the chat. And we have greetings from Mexico. Someone says, I'm sorry, I said Rhode Island audience, but welcome from Mexico. Thank you, great presentation. I actually got a few private chat questions that people have asked me. One person in particular has asked me to read, and she says that she is a single mother of 4 children going to an urban district, and she works, and her children and she herself grew up in an urban district as well. And she's asking, what, as a single mom with a full-time job, what are the most important things? How do I, teach resilience? How can I do that? What are the most important things is what she said.
So first of all, I mean, the whole point about building resilience means that it's probably not just going to be her. There's also probably, I mean, are there family members? Are there neighbors? Are there educators, coaches, etc.? One, the job of parenting is really meant to be a community concern. So anyone that you can bring in, extended family or otherwise, into that's the first thing. But the second thing is, I don't know what age she's talking about. I mean, obviously, if she's talking like 3 to 8 year olds, it's a little more difficult. But what we do know from resilience studies is also kids who understand that they're helping their parents survive. So if you have more young teenagers, asking them to actually be supportive of the family is not a bad thing, but it actually gives them a gift, the gift of contribution. So I often say to parents, who's packing the lunches? Who's getting the gear ready for the activity after school, if you have the energy even to take your kids to those things. I mean, like, kids have tremendous capacity, and somehow in our cultural space, I go around the world studying resilience in really impoverished places. I see kids making a contribution as young as like 10, 11, 12. I'm not talking about exploited working. I'm talking about with their families. I come back to Canada, the United States, and we don't give our kids any responsibilities. And then us parents are madly dashing, packing lunches and packing gear and running kids in cars to activities and doing all kinds of other crazy things with school and writing their assignments. I see that in universities, unfortunately. It's an insane world. And all this human capital, these kids are doing nothing. We're missing an opportunity here to help our kids, help us with the chores, help us get that routines in our lives and make a real contribution. And in the process, elevate their identity as well. And the mental health benefits are huge.
Thank you. I just want to read some of these comments. People just, wonderful workshop. Can't wait to share this information with my classmates. This is going to be a wonderful resource for incoming school psychologists. I believe that giving kids purpose is huge. When I work with teens, I listen for what they have in their life that gives them purpose.
Yeah.
Another student assistance counselor, private, asked or mentioned that, a lot of the work that we do is with kids who are living in families with substance use disorder, struggling with addiction. And, we often talk about just what you mentioned, the child who, 6, 7, 8 years old has to get up and make the lunches and get their siblings off to school. And, how do you change that, turn that around to a strength?
Well, what we actually know is that what the mechanism that when that's been studied as parentification or adultification, goes by 2 words, what they've actually shown is that if the child is acknowledged for their contribution, 2 things. The child has to be acknowledged for the contribution they're making. And second, they have to know that that contribution is necessary. So I'm able-bodied, I am well-resourced. If I tell my kid, make dinner every single night while I'm sitting on the television doing it, like my kid would go, what is with this? No, you're the parent, you should be functioning. There's no reason why you can't function well here, Dad. This is exploited, this is awful. That's traumatizing. But a child who actually knows that their parent is actually somehow incapacitated, and that's quite transparent, they'll actually understand that their contribution is necessary, and they're less likely to be traumatized by that contribution than the child who's being exploited. So if you can get that acknowledgement, a grandparent who looks down at the child and said, your mother, she's not doing well. This is so nice of you to help out. That kind of acknowledgement and other things. This is, again, that those resilience factors, this skin that we surround, this bubble that we put around kids that actually allows them to get the resources and the reinforcements that they need to cope. We give those to kids, they'll do okay.
Someone else also really appreciates your making the connection that you can't have resilience without social justice. Can you elaborate, in the short minutes that we have, what a little bit on that?
So when we do, most of my research takes place with people who don't look like me, don't have either my skin color, my language, my gender, my sexual orientation, whatever. So we're often looking across different diversity. And what we've actually learned is that it's very, if people aren't treated fairly, it's very difficult for them to find those other resources, right? So it's very hard to have a positive identity given to you by your community if you're looked down upon, or you were walking black. This is a common phenomenon where I guess we're If you're not able as a girl to have a sense of your future, as a professional, or any of those kinds of isms that enact it, or you're differently abled, all those things actually have a cumulative effect in people's lives. And we see, basically, just think about it as simple as this. Can people answer those questions I posed to you this evening, finish those sentences, unless they are treated fairly? And what happens is, as you're not treated fairly, of course, the answers get fewer and fewer. You're not feeling safe and well supported. You're not treated fairly in your home. The consequences that you have for your actions are out of whack to what happens. Your identities are challenged. The relationships you want to have are taken away from you based on where you live, et cetera, et cetera. So you begin to see there's a cascade effect. Efforts to actually put those things in place, thankfully, with the social justice movements that are now happening, like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous rights, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are actually having an impact on mental health. Think in a positive way.
Thank you. There are no more questions in the chat. Did anyone want to ask one? Be brave and ask one live in person. Well, virtually in person.
There is a question of, do you think that kids growing up with easier lives in terms of socioeconomic parents are growing up to be less resilient adults? And there's actually some growing evidence of that, actually, that children who are being at least overprotective parenting, finally, the research is getting together. And Nancy Perry at University of Minnesota did a study recently that showed that, over at least the first 10 years of a child's life, that overprotective parenting is actually disadvantaging kids in terms of their psychosocial development, as well as their academic performances. And I know anecdotally, as a university professor, that I'm seeing there's a really weird phenomenon of, young people, their parents are writing their assignments. They are not disengaging. They are not having the life skills necessary to cope in a world that demands things of them. And I think there is something that phrase affluenza, that phrase of, excessive wealth, excessive security, and just simply that is not producing the kind of children we want. I focus most on tonight on disadvantaged kids, but there's another problem. If you look at Sunya Luther's work, who studies resilience in families with incomes over $300,000, very affluent families, there's a different set of stressors there that are also causing mental health problems for kids long term. And the resilience of those kids depends on other kinds of factors, very similar, but expressed in different ways.
I always think the helicopter parent, though, is so class-based because, we consider it a problem, and yet a kid, growing up without anyone looking after her, would probably, give her ideas for a helicopter parent. So it's always
exactly. And there's a principle of that this differential impact of different things will affect kids in different ways depending on their risk profiles. And if you want to read more, if you look up work I published on differential impact, but it's exactly that story. You need to negotiate so you get what you need in ways that make sense.
Well, we are at an end. I would encourage everyone to check out Michael Ungar's website, his wonderful books, and other presentations that he has, and research that he's done. And we would hope to have you come back to Rhode Island, and maybe even in person and see you live. But or maybe we'll go to Halifax. That sounds nice too. Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
All the best, everyone.